A long time ago, I used to work in one of those buildings back there, and I was thinking about it recently because of events in the news. There was a fire one day. It wasn't really a big thing, just like a wastebasket fire, and we were too slow getting out of the office. We were too complacent. So the owner of the company said, I'm going to have someone come from the fire department to give you fire safety training. I remember we were waiting for the training to start, and the firefighter who was there was just making small talk, and he said, "You see those railroad tracks back there? The stuff they haul on that track scares the hell out of me." He said, "I wouldn't want to live anywhere near those railroad tracks." And it got me thinking. People do live on this street where I used to work, right across the street from the railroad tracks. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. I never even thought twice about those railroad tracks. I wonder if the people on this street know the risks involved in living so close. We take risks every day. Driving to work is far more of a risk than a chemical spill from a train. That's a situational risk we learn to accept, much like all the normal risks of everyday life. But there are a couple key differences between most of the regular risks we encounter and systemic or environmental risk. We're aware of most daily risks. They may not be right in the front of our minds, but we have a good sense of how risky an activity is. And after we've assessed the risk, we have the ability to decide on our level of exposure, or we can avoid the risk altogether by changing our behavior or the activity itself. In their 1998 piece, Towards a Critical Rhetoric of Risk Communication, published in Technical Communication Quarterly in 1998, Jeff Grable and Michelle Simmons discuss why traditional risk assessment models often fail to address concerns that stakeholders have. But before we talk about that, they do an excellent job summing up how we got to where we are now, details that sadly haven't changed much over the last 2 decades. In 1962, Rachel Carson's landmark environmental book, Silent Spring, warned of the dangers that human industrial contaminants pose to our natural world. It's an alarm bell for many at the time, signaling that our industrial activities can have serious repercussions on nature and our own health. At the end of that very decade, January 1969, Southern California, the Santa Barbara oil spill. A little ways down the coast in LA, dense smog caused by air pollution blankets the city. Later that year, summer 1969, Cleveland, Ohio, the Cuyahoga River catches fire. It happened so often that many residents and workers simply ignored it this time. Federal government of the United States takes action the following year, passing legislation that allows a new agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, to regulate companies that pollute air, soil, and water. They're tasked with determining safe levels of pollutants, monitoring companies to ensure compliance with the law, and punishing offenders. We probably have more information about risk all around us now than we have at any time in human history. But the question is, how do we interpret it? How do we know what's safe? Grable and Simmons argue that systemic risk is typically constructed and presented to us in two flawed models, the technocratic model and the negotiated model. In the technocratic model, scientists, or as we would term them in technical communication, subject matter experts, analyze data, formulate an assessment of the risk to stakeholders, those persons who are most likely to experience the effects of a hazard, and then they transmit their information directly to stakeholders. The thinking is that the expert is in the best position to assess risk to the general public since they have specialized training in science that is inaccessible to the general public. The public, in turn, is expected to implicitly trust the expert assessment. The other model Grable and Simmons discuss is the negotiated model of risk assessment. In this model, the stakeholders are given some input into constructing an assessment of the risk, such as a town hall hearing or putting a member of the public on a commission that assesses a risk. In theory, such participation gives the public agency, or the ability to influence the outcome of a risk assessment. The public, as represented in this model, should have the ability to interrogate whether something poses a risk to their community and take action to mitigate that risk. These models seem like they should effectively communicate information and help the public to accept and take action upon scientific findings regarding risk. So, why don't they work in real life? Well, in the case of the technocratic model, you have to think about how we perceive the world. This article that I pulled from the Chicago Tribune talks about the East Chicago community, which was located next to a lead smelting plant. Lead from the plant entered the atmosphere over many years and ended up settling on people's lawns in the neighborhood next to the plant. The gentleman quoted in the article was told by the EPA that lead levels were fine in his front yard, but that both neighbors on either side of their house needed remediation, which entailed the complete removal of all the grass and topsoil from their yard by a hazardous materials crew. This man relies on our first and most important risk assessment tool, common sense. Lead doesn't have a taste or smell and can't be detected outside the use of scientific equipment. But when you see that all your neighbors need remediation and a data sheet provided by the EPA indicates your yard does not, would more scientific data sway your opinion? Would you let your niece and nephew play in that yard? Or even let your dog dig around in that yard? What about the second model, the negotiated approach? Take the case of the defunct Medical Cannabis Advisory Board in Illinois. The board was made up of doctors and medical professionals and was tasked with reviewing diseases and conditions to determine whether medical marijuana should be permitted to help treat patients' symptoms. Their recommendations went to the director of Illinois Public Health, who summarily rejected all of their recommendations over a 2-year period. In this case, community members with specific knowledge of the issue and risks were given a position to speak directly with government regulators, but they were still powerless to do anything but recommend a course of action. They were coming from a relative position of authority and respect. Imagine being an average person with no specialized training who works in a profession not accorded the same high regard as a doctor or a professional. Now imagine standing in front of a disinterested government panel and being given only a few minutes to summarize your position. It's easy to understand the frustration of this approach, as you are technically given the ability to give input, but not the ability to make any change happen. Going back to Grable and Simmons, let's discuss why these approaches are problematic. The technocratic approach relies exclusively on observational data, which, while it can be scientifically rigorous, does not necessarily relate to how we interact with the world. Consider being told that your water is not contaminated, but every time you drink it, you feel nauseous. It's hard to ignore your 5 senses simply because a lab report tells you everything is fine. It also relies upon the ethos or credibility of the agency or individual communicating the risk. For instance, if you believe the federal government has a track record of failing to take into account stakeholder concerns, you're less likely to believe what they say no matter how detailed their evidence. Take, for example, the recent chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio. History is also a powerful factor. People tend to make predictions based on past events. Would you believe me if I told you that not only was there a train accident similar to the one in East Palestine, but that the train was carrying the exact same chemical, and this accident happened 40 years ago? Stakeholders are less likely to believe that anything will change as a result of this type of risk assessment, since they have already seen it once before. It's a process we'll come back to in this series when we talk about communication failures. In the negotiated approach, when it becomes evident that the role of stakeholders is limited to an advisory capacity, or any euphemism that indicates a lack of actual power to make meaningful change, the stakeholders begin to doubt whether or not they have any real say in the matter. Such an approach is often used as a means of demonstrating to the public that their opinion has been taken into account, when, in actuality, stakeholder involvement is used to mask the fact that decision makers do not value public input and won't be taking their suggestions into account in the risk assessment process. So, how do we solve this problem? Grable and Simmons suggest the answer lies in greater transparency and giving the public actual agency in the risk assessment process. Oftentimes, stakeholders have knowledge specific to a region or topic due to their lived experience, knowledge that even subject matters do not possess or know exists. An excellent example of this is the case of the Four Corners hantavirus outbreak in 1993. Several residents of the Navajo tribal reservation in the American Southwest were infected with hantavirus, an extremely deadly pathogen with a 50% mortality rate. The CDC had observed similar symptoms exhibited by soldiers during the Korean War, but could not make the connection between that disease and the Four Corners region of the US. Traditional Navajo healers, known as medicine men, had passed down knowledge of the disease through storytelling, specifically in times of high spring rains that the local evergreens would produce piña nuts and the deer mice population would explode. They also associated mice with bad luck. A local parable said that if a mouse ever ran over your clothing, you should burn it. Using that local knowledge, the CDC localized the infection and discovered that fecal material from the deer mice spread the disease. It was inhaled by residents when they were sweeping up unused areas of their home or outbuildings. Were it not for the inclusion of local stakeholders in the risk assessment process, analysis of the risk in this scenario may have been prolonged, leading to additional loss of life beyond the 13 local residents who perished in the outbreak. Going back to Grable and Simmons, the authors borrow from Bob Johnson, a professor and proponent of usability testing, to state that users are not quote unquote dumb. Even though they may not possess the specialized training of subject matter experts, they have other qualities that make them uniquely adept at assessing risk and solving problems. Stakeholders, just like technical communicators, create knowledge. They are creative and can view problems in ways that outsiders cannot, drawing on traditional or local knowledge that outsiders are unaware of. They are also, as citizens, highly invested in local and long term outcomes in a way that outsiders are not. Excluding the public or relegating them to a role without agency allows policymakers to avoid debate and quickly move forward on a course of action. But at what cost? When researchers, scientists, and government officials disregard stakeholder concerns when assessing risk, they are setting themselves up for community opposition and also missing out on knowledge that may mitigate risk, increase stakeholder buy in to the eventual course of action, and ultimately help people to feel secure that decisions made in the community affairs have their best interests in mind.